1,000 years ago, in a small Syrian town called Mara, a man closed his door to the world. He was not a hermit out of fear, nor a mystic searching for visions in silence. He shut himself away because he had seen too much. His name was Alaa Al-Maari, the blind poet, the heretic of reason, the philosopher who refused the world. He lost his sight when he was only 4 years old, yet that darkness seemed to open another kind of vision. Blind to the world's colors, he saw instead its illusions, the faiths that divided men, the hopes that deceived them, the cruelty that passed as virtue. He lived during what we now call the Islamic Golden Age, a time when poetry, science, and theology lived side by side. Cities like Baghdad and Damascus were full of scholars and saints, thinkers and dreamers. But in his quiet house in Mara, Al-Maari sat apart, listening to the distant noise of a world busy chasing meaning. He once wrote, "This wrong was by my father done to me, but never by me to one." It sounds like a riddle, but it was a declaration of revolt. He meant that being born was a harm he would not pass on. Life, to him, was not a gift, but an injury, a cycle of pain that only compassion could break. And the most honest act of compassion, he thought, was to refuse to create more suffering. So he never married. He had no children. He ate no meat, harmed no creature, and lived in quiet poverty. He believed that to live rightly was to do as little harm as possible, to walk gently through a world already bleeding. Those who met him described him as calm, thoughtful, and gentle, yet his ideas spread like fire. Some called him a skeptic, others a blasphemer. A few whispered that his blindness was God's punishment, but Al-Maari saw it differently. To him, blindness was not a curse, it was freedom, a way to escape the illusions that sight so easily creates. Men's eyes are open, he said, yet they see nothing. He was blind, but he had seen the truth too clearly. Though he chose silence, the world would not leave him alone. Poets and philosophers came to debate him, expecting argument, and found instead a quiet man who dismantled their certainties with calm precision. He doubted prophets, rejected dogmas, and trusted only reason. In an age where faith ruled thought, Alaa Al-Maari stood alone, a mind unbowed, a heart untamed, a man who refused both comfort and illusion. Outside, empires rose and fell. Inside his small home, Al-Maari wrote words that would echo across centuries, words that questioned everything, even the meaning of life itself. To believers, he was a warning. To doubters, he was a revelation. He had turned away from the world, yet the world kept returning to his door. He had chosen darkness, yet through that darkness, he saw more clearly than most who lived in the light. To understand how radical Alaa Al-Maari was, we must first understand the age he lived in. It was a time when the world seemed full of light. Knowledge flourished under caliphs and scholars. Astronomers mapped the heavens. Physicians studied the human body. Mathematicians played with infinity. Poets filled palaces with verses about love, honor, and divine truth. And above all, this intellectual glory stood faith, vast, unquestioned, absolute. In that world, faith was not just a belief. It was the structure of existence itself. It shaped law, language, morality, and imagination. Every question, from the stars above to the heart of man, was expected to return to one answer: God. To doubt that answer was not courage. It was madness. It was suicide. Yet in his small house in Mara, one blind man was asking those forbidden questions. Alaa Al-Maari listened to the prayers, the sermons, the endless arguments of theologians, and heard something hollow behind them. He heard certainty where there should have been wonder. He heard pride where there should have been humility. He saw men who claimed to speak for God but seemed only to serve themselves. He once wrote, "The world holds two classes of men, intelligent men without religion, and religious men without intelligence." That single line would have been enough to condemn him in most courts, but it was not blasphemy that drove him, it was honesty. Al-Maari had studied the scriptures of many faiths, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and found the same human hand behind them all. The same fear of death, the same hunger for meaning, the same need to make sense of chaos. He saw religion as a human invention, a story that grew like ivy around the walls of our fear. And yet, he did not laugh at belief. He did not rage against it as some later skeptics would. His tone was quieter, more sorrowful. He pitied mankind's need for illusions because he understood it. He too longed for meaning, but he refused to invent one. He would rather live in uncertainty than kneel to a comforting lie. His skepticism was not cold logic alone. It was moral. To him, falsehood was the root of suffering. The priests, the rulers, the merchants of faith, they all claimed to act in God's name, yet their actions led to war, oppression, and hypocrisy. Al-Maari looked at them and saw not holiness, but vanity dressed in sacred words. He believed that the gods men worshipped were reflections of their own desires. Each creed mirrored its people, their fears, their hopes, their cruelty. He once wrote, "They all err, Muslims, Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. Mankind goes astray in all directions." It was not a cry of hatred. It was the observation of a man who saw too much of human folly. In that line, you can feel both his distance and his compassion. He had no hatred for believers. He only mourned the blindness of a world that worshipped its own shadow. To his contemporaries, Al-Maari's ideas were like a mirror no one wanted to look into. Theologians debated him, poets feared him, rulers ignored him, and yet his reputation spread. His verses were copied in secret, whispered among students who admired his courage but dared not say so aloud. While other poets sang of paradise and love, Al-Maari wrote of reason, despair, and the endless cycle of human error. His poetry was not meant to please. It was meant to awaken. Each line stripped away illusion after illusion until nothing was left but the truth and the silence that follows it. If he lived today, some might call him an existentialist, a rationalist, even a nihilist. But these words did not exist in his time. He was simply a man unwilling to lie to himself. He looked at faith, power, and pleasure, and saw the same emptiness hiding beneath them all. Yet he was not without compassion. His disbelief was not arrogance. It was humility before the vast mystery of existence. He refused to claim knowledge of things unseen, and that refusal in a world of dogma was the purest act of faith. Not in gods, but in truth itself. The scholars of his time loved arguments that circled endlessly, balancing divine justice and human reason. But Al-Maari's logic was simpler and more terrifying. If life is filled with suffering, and if men continue to harm each other in the name of belief, then perhaps the problem is not our faith, but our existence itself. In him, there was something both ancient and modern, a voice that sounded like it had come from another world, warning this one of its delusions. He was a skeptic before Voltaire, a pessimist before Schopenhauer, a moral thinker before modern ethics had a name. 1,000 years before Nietzsche declared that God was dead, Abu Ala al-Maari had already withdrawn from a world he believed was deceived by gods of its own making. He did not seek to destroy faith. He only sought to free the mind from it, and that perhaps is the most dangerous act of all. His contemporaries lived in an age of faith. He lived in an age of doubt, alone, surrounded by the noise of certainties he could no longer share. The poetry of Abu Ala al-Maari is not meant to comfort. It is meant to confront. It does not ask the reader to believe, but to think. It does not praise the world, but exposes it. A place of fleeting pleasure and lasting pain, of blind rituals and inherited lies. In his verses, you can feel the struggle of a man who loved reason but could not escape sorrow. He called his most famous collection Luzumiyat, a title that can mean the necessary things. The poems are austere, stripped of ornament, often dark and ironic. Each line seems to weigh the worth of existence itself. There are no songs of joy, no praise of kings or lovers, only the voice of a man alone with his thoughts, asking why we live, why we suffer, and why we continue to pretend there is meaning in it all. He wrote, "They all err, Muslims, Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. Mankind goes astray in all directions." In that single sentence lies the essence of his philosophy, that no creed holds the truth, that each human group builds its own illusion and guards it as sacred. But behind the irony, there is no hatred, only a weary compassion. Al-Maari did not despise humanity, he pitied it. He saw people as lost children, wandering through the fog of tradition, too afraid to admit they are lost. Reason was his compass. He believed that truth could not be inherited. It must be earned through thought. But reason for him was not merely logic, it was moral clarity. To live rationally was to live gently. To understand that the world is filled with suffering is to refuse to add more to it. He became a vegetarian long before the word existed. He refused to wear wool, for it came from the bodies of animals. He would not drink milk or eat eggs, because he saw in them the theft of another creature's life. To many around him, these habits seemed extreme, even absurd. But for Al-Maari, they were the natural expression of a mind that saw all life as bound together in pain. To harm another being, however small, was to deepen the sorrow of the world. In his verses, he often spoke of animals with a tenderness that few men of his age understood. He wrote that animals suffer silently, without the comfort of illusion, and that humans, with their religions and empires, are often the cruelest of all creatures. His compassion extended beyond his species, a rare, almost modern sensibility. And yet, beneath this gentleness, there was a deep melancholy. His rationalism gave him clarity, but not peace. To see the world as it truly is, he believed, was to lose all reason for joy. Hope, in his view, was a form of self-deception. It made men endure what they should question, obey what they should resist, and love what they should see clearly as transient and empty. He often wrote of death with a strange calmness, as if it were not an end, but a release. The grave, he said, is the only refuge from the injustice of life. He did not seek death, but he did not fear it. He saw it as the final truth that puts an end to all illusions. In one of his most haunting lines, he wrote that life is a prison where the gates open only one way. Yet even in his despair, there was a kind of moral beauty. He did not sink into bitterness. He did not become cruel or careless. Instead, he chose restraint, simplicity, and honesty. He believed that while life may be meaningless, our conduct within it still matters. He once wrote that the true philosopher is not the one who explains the world, but the one who refuses to add to its evil. In this way, Al-Maari stood closer to the ethics of compassion than to the cold logic of nihilism. He may have seen no purpose in existence, but he found meaning in kindness. For him, morality did not need the promise of heaven or the threat of hell. It was enough to see suffering and choose not to increase it. His verses often sound like the reflections of a man standing at the edge of time. He looks upon human history and sees a long procession of faiths, empires, wars, and graves, each generation repeating the same mistakes, each convinced it is different from the last. He mocks the pride of kings, the vanity of scholars, the blind devotion of believers, and the endless arguments of priests. He once compared the world to a vast marketplace where men trade lies as if they were treasures. But if he despised anything, it was hypocrisy, the pretense of virtue, the claim of certainty. He saw how easily faith becomes a tool for power, how men kill in the name of mercy and enslave in the name of truth. He called for honesty, not the shallow honesty of words, but the deeper one of facing existence without comfort. In Luzumiyat, the voice of Al-Maari is solitary and severe, yet strangely intimate. It feels as if he is speaking directly to the listener across the centuries. His words are not old, they sound disturbingly current. When he writes about superstition and ignorance, it feels like he is describing our own world, our politics, our self-deceptions, our need for illusions. He was a poet of reason, but also a poet of despair, not because he loved suffering, but because he refused to lie about it. In his eyes, the world was a burning house, and men kept singing hymns instead of finding the exit. And yet, in his silence and solitude, he created something enduring, a poetry that stripped existence down to its bare truth, and in that truth found a strange, quiet dignity. He once said that the only true philosopher is the one who harms no one. That for him was enough. In an age of power and piety, he chose the smallest possible life, and through that smallness became vast. Labels travel faster than ideas. In the streets and courts, far from his quiet home, Abu Alaa Al-Maari became a name that carried a warning: heretic, pessimist, atheist, monster. These were not neutral descriptions. They were attempts to contain a mind that refused containment. But the story of Al-Maari as heretic is more interesting when you look at how and why that label stuck, and what it tells us about the world that wanted to brand him. First, the social mechanics. In most pre-modern societies, belief and belonging were entwined. To challenge widely held certainties was to disturb public order. Al-Maari did not march in the streets or plot against rulers. He sat in his house and wrote. That quiet refusal to perform loyalty to the sacred narratives felt dangerous. A private doubt became a public threat because it suggested that the most intimate acts of social cohesion, prayer, ritual, trust in authority, might rest on fragile ground. So the heresy attached to him was partly the product of fear, but it was also the product of style. Al-Maari's tone could be merciless. He used irony and paradox as tools to reveal contradictions. He would invert praise into parody. He would applaud a folly until the audience realized the praise had become a mirror. Satire was his scalpel. Where others aimed to soothe or persuade, he aimed to expose. That method unsettled people more than any systematic philosophical pamphlet could. Satire makes its readers complicit, and then strips away the comfort of denial. Rumor grew around those knives. Some accounts, centuries later, repeated grotesque stories about his life as if scandal could replace argument. There are tales told in later chronicles that Al-Maari committed acts so shocking they would prove his moral emptiness. Those stories have the texture of folklore. They are the noises a frightened culture makes when a thinker refuses to be domesticated. It is important to separate the text from the gossip. The poems themselves, for those who read them without the intervening haze of rumor, reveal a mind rigorously ethical in its own way, not the amorality gossip ascribes to him. Another reason the heretic label stuck was institutional. Religious authorities, court poets and moralists had a stake in maintaining a narrative of unanimity. When a voice undermined that unanimity, the easiest path was to delegitimize the voice rather than engage its claims. So questions that deserved debate were sometimes treated as signs of dangerous character. The strategy worked. Reputation ossified. A complex set of arguments was flattened into a scandalous reputation. Yet despite the scorn, Al-Maari's work survived. That survival is part of the paradox. Books in the medieval Islamic world were copied by hand. Manuscripts moved with merchants, students, and scholars. Censors could burn a text, but they could not kill curiosity. Copies of his poems circulated in private libraries and in the margins of scholarly notebooks. His survival shows what all censorship reveals: the power of truth to persist precisely because it unsettles and fascinates. People saved his words, not just because they agreed with them, but because his work mattered. As a challenge, as a provocation, as an intellectual test. There is also a cultural irony. In a civilization that prized eloquence, Al-Maari was a master of language. His technical skill as a poet made him difficult to dismiss. Even if authorities hated his conclusions, they could not deny the craft. This is important. It is one thing to suppress an idea. It is another to suppress a voice whose phrasing becomes a model. Over time, new readers found in his language a resource for their own thought. The very excellence that earned him enemies also ensured his survival. We should also look at his heresy in moral terms rather than merely doctrinal ones. Al-Maari's challenge was ethical at its core. He did not attack theology as an abstract system alone. He attacked the moral consequences of religious institutions when they served power rather than compassion. That is why his critique still cuts. He saw how certainty can become cruelty. He traced the line from dogma to violence, from sacred text to social harm. In many ways, his heresy was the claim that the truest form of piety might be refusal. Refusal to let ritual excuse cruelty. Refusal to let myth excuse oppression. This makes his classification difficult. Was he simply a nihilist who loved paradox? Or was he a moralist using radical means to insist that ethics cannot depend on fictions? The evidence from his writing leans toward the latter. His sharpest attacks are not aimed at belief for belief's sake. They are aimed at the human abuses that belief enables. He refuses comforting illusions because he thinks they permit and rationalize harm. From that perspective, the heretic label is too small. He is not merely a dissenter of doctrine. He is a critic of social practices that pass as sanctity. Another dimension of his heresy concerns audience and pedagogy. Al-Maari did not write in an ivory tower. His work was read aloud, debated, copied into anthologies, and quoted by opponents as much as by admirers. That active life of the text invited responses. Some readers tried to assimilate his ironies into orthodox frameworks, softening his edges. Others embraced him as a model of moral independence. Still others turned him into a caricature. The variety of receptions demonstrates how unstable categories like heretic or sage can be across time. Finally, the heretic narrative tells us about memory. Societies remember what they can explain. When a thinker resists simple explanation, memory often reduces him to a label that fits a story the society prefers to tell. Al-Maari's label as heretic reveals more about the anxieties of later generations than it does about his intentions. If we peel back the layers of rumor and caricature, we find a thinker whose insistence on intellectual honesty makes him both dangerous and invaluable. So was he a nihilist or a seeker of purity beyond illusion? He was neither wholly and exclusively. He resembles a craftsman who, having examined every joint and beam of a collapsing house, decides to stay and refuse to hammer in new nails that will only make the collapse more elegant. He declined to build consolations. He refused to multiply illusions. Yet he did not abandon moral practice. He practiced restraint, slow living, careful language, and an ethic of minimal harm. His heresy is therefore a strange hybrid. It is the refusal of certain comforts married to an austere moral seriousness. In the end, the term heretic captures the social reaction to Abu Ala Al-Maari more than it captures his philosophical profile. He forced his culture to look at the moral price of its certainties. That is a role that will always attract scorn and respect in unequal measure. His reputation remains a mirror in which societies see how they handle dissent. Do they ask the dissenter to conform, or do they listen and change? The story of Al-Maari shows how often the first impulse is containment, but the longer arc bends toward preservation. Great dissenters seldom vanish. Their words, once released, find readers who need them for reasons the original society could not foresee. When Abu Ala Al-Maari closed his door, he could not close the future. His silence was not the end of his voice. It traveled in ink and on parchment, carried by students, traders, copyists, and curious men who could not help returning to his lines. Manuscripts survived in places he never knew. Marginal notes accumulated over centuries. Readers argued with him, praised him, hated him, and in the process kept him alive. That survival is itself a kind of answer. It means his questions did not expire with his age. They kept finding listeners who needed to hear them. What does it mean for a thinker to live beyond his context? For Abu Ala Al-Maari, it meant that his words could be reheard in very different debates. Centuries later, when European thought turned inward and asked hard questions about God, meaning, and morality, there were echoes that sounded faintly like his voice. This is not a claim that he directly inspired Nietzsche or Voltaire. The lines of influence are not that simple. Instead, it is a claim about similarity of insight. Two minds separated by place and time can nonetheless look at the same human condition and arrive at similar conclusions. Al-Maari anticipated themes that would later appear under new names. He anticipated existential angst, the ethical weight of nonviolence, and a moral critique that did not depend on divine sanction. He appears in modern conversations in two main ways. First, as a precursor to certain ethical positions, his refusal to eat meat and his insistence on avoiding unnecessary harm place him among the very earliest voices in what we now call animal ethics. He extended moral concern beyond his own species at a time when such compassion was rare. Second, as an early expression of anti-natalist thought, that choice to refuse family was more than personal austerity. It was a philosophical gesture, a radical application of the principle that it is wrong to impose suffering on beings who cannot consent. Today, anti-natalism is a niche debate in ethics and population studies. In his era, it was almost unimaginable. That he arrived at such a view independently shows the seriousness with which he treated suffering as a moral problem. Beyond those concrete positions, Al-Maari matters as a model of intellectual honesty. He reminds us that truth is not always consoling. Sometimes truth dismantles our hopes and leaves us naked. He accepted that cost. He preferred a life of minimal harm and maximal clarity over the comforts of comforting illusions. That posture has been both admired and feared. Admirers see in him the rare integrity of a thinker who would not prostitute his mind to convenience. Critics see only negativity, a refusal to participate in the bonds that make communal life possible. Both reactions tell us something important about what societies expect from their thinkers. There is also a lesson about reception and misreading. In later centuries, commentators sometimes turned him into what they needed him to be. Some portrayed him as simply a comic, pessimistic poet, others as an immoral provocateur. Modern scholars have had to separate the later gossip from the text itself. When we recover the original voice, we find a nuanced ethic that refuses simple labels. He is not merely a destroyer of myth. He is also a builder of small moral practices: careful speech, diet, restraint, and a refusal to add to the world's pain. Those practical commitments complicate the caricature of him as a mere cynic. His style also contributed to his afterlife. He wrote with a precision and a beauty that made his work worth copying even to those who disagreed with his conclusions. That is important. Great ideas survive not only because of their novelty, but because they are carried in language that others find hard to forget. Al-Maari's craft turned his dissent into literature. The aesthetic quality of his poetry ensured that even opponents could not simply throw it away. There is a political and cultural dimension to his legacy too. In many modern societies that prize secular thought and critical inquiry, Al-Maari is reclaimed as an ancestor of skepticism. His courage to question authority, to criticize clerical hypocrisy, and to insist on independent judgment resonates in movements that seek freedom of conscience. At the same time, some religious readers have found in his work a moral interlocutor. They insist that even if one rejects his conclusions, his moral concern for the suffering of others is a value they can respect. This double reception shows that his work is not a closed book. It continues to be a resource people read with different aims. There is a final, quieter way his voice matters. He is a mirror. Great mirrors do not flatter. They show what is there. When a society reads Al-Maari, it sees parts of itself that it might prefer to ignore. Its cruelty dressed as piety, its habit of turning suffering into ritual, its willingness to name truth and thereby avoid acting on it. That reflective power is why he still unsettles us. He does not offer easy remedies. He offers diagnosis, and diagnosis often precedes discomfort. And there is the more personal legacy. For those who choose the life of the mind, Al-Maari poses a question about the cost of seeing. Knowledge is a gift, but it can also be a burden. He carried that burden with austerity. He chose a life of smallness rather than one of comfortable illusions. In an age that often values spectacle and affirmation, his example is both a challenge and a consolation. It asks us to consider whether integrity is worth loneliness, and whether moral restraint can itself be a form of heroism. As the light fades on his era, as scripts become fragments and dust settles on their edges, his final lines still speak. They ask us to look at ourselves without softening. They do not tell us what to do. They demand that we decide with clear eyes what kind of lives we will lead. If truth leads only to despair, is ignorance a mercy or a curse? The question hangs in the air like a lantern above a silent town. It is not a trap. It is an invitation. To answer it, we must first decide whether the value of truth is measured by the comfort it brings or by the moral weight it imposes. Abu Ala Al-Maari left the world no map. He left a way of seeing and a set of practices that followed that seeing. Whether we follow him or not, he forces us to ask whether our comforts are worth the cost they demand from others and from ourselves.